The rain had started sometime before dawn and continued long after the city had awakened. From the small kitchen window of her apartment, Emily Carter watched water slide down the glass in crooked lines while the streets below filled with people rushing toward offices, meetings, and responsibilities. Everyone seemed to have somewhere important to be. Everyone except her. A cup of coffee sat untouched in front of her, its warmth long gone, but she barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on the world outside, as if she were watching a life that no longer belonged to her. 3 years earlier, mornings had looked very different. She used to begin her days in a corner office overlooking downtown Chicago, answering calls from investors and preparing presentations that could move millions of dollars with a single decision. Her calendar was always full. Her phone never stopped ringing. People waited weeks for a chance to meet with her. Business magazines called her one of the most influential female CEOs in the country. Back then, she believed success was something permanent, something that could be protected through intelligence, discipline, and hard work. Now she lived in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat where the walls were thin enough to hear conversations from neighboring units. The furniture had come from second-hand stores. The refrigerator rattled loudly every few minutes, and the heating system worked only when it felt like cooperating. Nothing inside the apartment hinted that the woman sitting alone at the kitchen table had once built a company valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. The world had moved on, and it had taken her place with it. A small stack of unopened envelopes rested beside her coffee cup. Emily didn't need to read them to know what they contained. Overdue notices, payment reminders, and warnings written in polite corporate language that all carried the same message. She had seen enough of them during the past year to recognize every envelope before opening it. The irony wasn't lost on her. For decades she had signed checks, approved budgets, and managed financial departments. Now she spent most mornings calculating how far she could stretch the few dollars remaining in her bank account. Her eyes eventually drifted toward a framed photograph sitting near the window. It showed a younger version of herself standing in front of the first office she had ever rented. The building wasn't impressive. It sat above an aging hardware store, and the sign outside had been slightly crooked. Yet the smile on her face that day looked genuine in a way few photographs ever captured. She remembered believing that anything was possible. She remembered thinking that success would solve every problem she might someday face. Looking back now, that confidence felt like something that had belonged to another person entirely. The vibration of her phone broke the silence. For a brief moment, hope stirred inside her chest. It was a ridiculous reaction, but she couldn't stop it. Today was her birthday. Somewhere deep down, a small part of her still expected someone to remember. Maybe an old friend, maybe a former colleague, maybe a distant relative she hadn't spoken with recently. Instead, when she unlocked the screen, she found a notification from her bank reminding her that an account balance had fallen below the recommended minimum. Emily leaned back in her chair and released a slow breath. Then she laughed softly to herself, not because anything was funny, but because disappointment had become so familiar that it almost felt predictable. 52 years old, once celebrated by hundreds of employees, once surrounded by people eager to earn her approval. And on this birthday morning, the only message she had received came from a computer-generated banking system. The truth wasn't that people had forgotten her birthday. The truth was much harder than that. Most of them had forgotten her. When Carter Innovations collapsed, the disappearance of money had been painful. The disappearance of people had been devastating. Investors who once praised her vision stopped answering calls. Business associates who had attended charity galas at her side suddenly acted as though they barely knew her name. Even friendships she believed were genuine seemed to evaporate the moment there was no longer anything to gain from knowing her. The experience had taught her a lesson no business school ever could. Success attracts crowds. Failure reveals who would have stayed even without it. Unable to sit in the apartment any longer, Emily pulled on her coat and stepped outside. The cold air immediately wrapped around her, carrying the scent of wet pavement and distant traffic. Chicago looked beautiful in the rain. The skyscrapers disappeared into low clouds while reflections of traffic lights shimmered across the streets like scattered gold. Years ago, she had loved walking through the city because it felt like a place filled with opportunity. Today, it felt more like a reminder of everything she had lost. She wandered for nearly an hour without any destination in mind. Office workers hurried past carrying umbrellas and coffee cups. Delivery trucks unloaded supplies. Restaurant owners prepared for lunch crowds. Nobody recognized her. Nobody looked twice. For most people, it would have seemed normal. For Emily, it felt like living inside a strange, alternate reality. There had been a time when strangers asked for photographs after seeing her on television interviews. Now she could pass hundreds of people without a single person noticing she existed. And somehow, on her birthday of all days, that hurt more than she wanted to admit. At last she found herself standing outside a small bakery she used to visit years ago. Warm light glowed through the windows, and every time the door opened, the scent of fresh cinnamon and baked bread drifted onto the sidewalk. She checked the contents of her wallet before entering. $23 remained. That money needed to last until the following week, but after a few seconds of hesitation, she pushed open the door anyway. If nobody else was going to celebrate her birthday, perhaps she could at least buy herself a cup of coffee. What Emily didn't know was that before the day ended, a simple walk through the city would place her on a path she never could have imagined. A stranger was about to enter her life, and neither of them had any idea how much the other needed that meeting. Emily remained inside the bakery longer than she intended. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, leaving the streets coated in reflections that shimmered beneath the fatting afternoon light. Most of the customers who had crowded the tables during lunch had already left, and the noise inside the room had softened into the gentle hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clink of coffee cups. It was the kind of peaceful atmosphere she once would have enjoyed without thinking. Now it felt like a temporary shelter from a world she no longer knew how to navigate. She sat near the window, turning her coffee cup slowly between her hands while watching pedestrians move along the sidewalk. Every face seemed to belong somewhere. Every person appeared connected to a life that mattered to someone else. Emily tried not to dwell on the thought, but loneliness had a way of finding its own path into quiet moments. It wasn't simply that she was alone. It was the realization that very few people would notice if she disappeared from the city entirely. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, she finally gathered her purse and stood. The bakery staff had begun wiping tables and preparing for the dinner rush, and she felt guilty occupying the same seat for so long after purchasing only a single coffee. Pulling her coat tighter around herself, she stepped outside and started walking without any clear destination. The rain had stopped completely now, replaced by a cool breeze that carried the scent of wet pavement and fresh air. For the first time all day, the clouds were beginning to break apart. Golden sunlight spilled between buildings and stretched across the streets, turning puddles into pools of liquid amber. The city looked transformed. It reminded Emily of something her father used to tell her when she was young. He believed storms revealed beauty that sunny days often hid. At the time, she had never understood what he meant. Standing there now, she wondered if perhaps he had been right. Lost in thought, she eventually wandered toward one of the city's public parks. The place was familiar. Years earlier, she had often passed through it on her way to meetings downtown. Back then, she rarely slowed her pace. There had always been another appointment waiting, another problem demanding attention, another opportunity she was afraid to miss. Today, she had nowhere to be. The realization felt strangely freeing. As she approached the park entrance, she noticed a small crowd gathered near one of the benches. People weren't behaving the way tourists normally did. They weren't admiring scenery or taking pictures of landmarks. Instead, they seemed focused on a single person sitting quietly beneath a large oak tree. Some whispered to each other. Others glanced repeatedly in the same direction. A few pulled out their phones, though they appeared hesitant to approach. Emily barely paid attention at first. Chicago was full of celebrities, athletes, and public figures passing through town. Whatever had captured everyone's interest had nothing to do with her. She continued walking along the path, keeping her eyes forward as she moved through the park. Then she noticed him. The man sat alone on the bench, wearing a dark jacket, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. There was nothing flashy about him. No security team surrounded him. No expensive car waited nearby. In fact, he looked more like an ordinary traveler taking a moment to enjoy the evening than someone attracting attention from strangers. Yet there was something familiar about him. Emily couldn't immediately place it. As she drew closer, she noticed that while people were staring at him, he seemed completely unaware of the attention. His focus remained on the sunset filtering through the trees. There was a calmness about him that felt unusual in a world where everyone seemed desperate to be noticed. For a brief moment, their eyes met. It lasted no more than a second. The man offered a small, polite smile. Emily instinctively nodded, before continuing along the path. Ordinarily, that would have been the end of it. But after several steps, something unexpected happened. "Ma'am," the voice came from behind her. Emily turned. The man had risen from the bench. "Excuse me," he said. "I think you dropped this." Confused, she looked down. A folded receipt lay near his hand. She checked her purse and realized it had slipped out when she removed her wallet at the bakery earlier. "Oh." She walked back toward him. "Thank you." "You're welcome." His voice was warm and relaxed, completely free of the forced friendliness she had grown accustomed to hearing from people during her years in business. There was something refreshing about that. As she accepted the receipt, she finally recognized him. The realization struck almost immediately. Keanu Reeves. For a second, she wondered whether she was mistaken. The casual clothes and simple appearance made him look remarkably different from the polished images seen in movies and magazines. Yet there was no denying it. It was him. Oddly enough, Emily wasn't impressed. 5 years earlier, she probably would have been. She might have asked for a photograph or mentioned one of his films, but life had stripped away much of her fascination with fame. Wealth and status no longer carried the magic they once did. Still, she was surprised. "Thank you again," she said. "No problem." There was a brief silence. Most people in that situation would have tried extending the conversation. Instead, both of them seemed perfectly comfortable allowing the moment to end naturally. Then Keanu glanced toward the bakery receipt in her hand. "Birthday coffee?" he asked. Emily looked down. Printed across the receipt was a promotional message offering birthday discounts. She laughed softly. "I guess that gave me away." "A little." His smile widened. "Happy birthday." Those two simple words hit harder than she expected. Throughout the entire day, nobody had said them. Not a friend. Not a relative. Not a former colleague. Not a single person. And somehow hearing them from a stranger felt surprisingly emotional. "Thank you," she replied quietly. Something in her expression must have revealed more than she intended, because his smile faded slightly. "Not the best birthday." Emily considered giving the usual answer. The polite answer. The answer people offered when they didn't want to discuss personal problems. Instead, she found herself telling the truth. "I've had better." Keanu nodded as if he understood, without requiring further explanation. He didn't ask intrusive questions. He didn't offer meaningless advice. He simply accepted her answer. For some reason, that made her trust him. The evening breeze stirred the branches overhead while sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shifting patterns across the ground between them. Around the park, people continued watching from a distance, hopping for photographs or conversations. Yet Keanu seemed entirely unconcerned by their attention. "Well," he said after a moment, "for what it's worth, I hope next year's birthday is better." Emily smiled. "So do I." Neither of them knew it then, but those words would prove more meaningful than either expected. Because before the following birthday arrived, everything in Emily Carter's life was about to change. And this small encounter in a city park was only the beginning. For the next several days, Emily found herself thinking about the stranger in the park far more often than she expected. It wasn't because he was famous. In fact, that part mattered very little to her. After everything she had experienced during the past few years, celebrity status no longer impressed her. What stayed with her was something much simpler. He had treated her like a person instead of a headline, a former executive, or a failure. He hadn't asked what she did for a living. He hadn't tried to figure out whether she was important. He had simply noticed that she looked lonely on her birthday and offered kindness without expecting anything in return. The memory followed her through the week as she returned to her normal routine. Mornings were spent searching job listings, afternoons were filled with consulting applications that rarely received responses, and evenings often ended with her sitting by the apartment window watching the city lights flicker across the skyline. The savings she had once believed would last years were nearly gone now. Every expense required careful calculation. Every purchase felt like a negotiation with the future. One Thursday afternoon, Emily was sitting in a public library reviewing employment listings when an email appeared in her inbox. At first, she almost ignored it. Most messages arriving these days were advertisements, automated responses, or polite rejections. This one was different. The sender's name caught her attention immediately. A local nonprofit organization was seeking volunteer business advisors for a mentorship program helping struggling entrepreneurs. The position wasn't paid, but they were looking for experienced executives willing to mentor small business owners facing financial difficulties. Emily stared at the screen for several seconds. Years ago, she would have dismissed the opportunity without a second thought. Her schedule had been too valuable, her responsibilities too large. Now, however, she found herself reading every line carefully. Something about helping people rebuild businesses appealed to her in a way she hadn't expected. Perhaps because she understood what it felt like to lose one. Without giving herself time to overthink the decision, she submitted an application. 3 days later, they called. The following Wednesday, she found herself walking into a modest community center on the north side of the city. The building was far from impressive. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the conference rooms were simple and functional. Yet there was an energy inside that reminded her of the early days of her own company. People weren't there because they were successful. They were there because they were trying. That difference mattered. As the orientation session began, Emily listened while local entrepreneurs shared stories about their businesses. Some owned small restaurants. Others ran family stores, repair shops, or service companies. Many were struggling with debt, declining sales, or difficult market conditions. Their challenges felt painfully familiar. Listening to them was like opening a photo album filled with memories she had spent years trying to forget. For a long time, Emily rarely spoke about what had happened to Carter Innovations. The collapse had become one of those subjects people avoided out of politeness, while she avoided it out of pain. Yet sitting in that room, she realized she could no longer tell her story without confronting the truth. The company hadn't failed because of bad luck. It had failed because of betrayal. Nearly 6 years earlier, Carter Innovations had reached its peak. The technology firm employed hundreds of people and operated in multiple states. Investors were eager to expand internationally, and the company's future looked brighter than ever. During that period, Emily trusted very few people completely. One of those people was Daniel Mercer. Daniel had joined the company during its earliest years and eventually became chief financial officer. He attended family holidays. He knew her parents. He had celebrated birthdays with her staff. For more than a decade, Emily considered him not only a colleague but one of her closest friends. Which was exactly why she never saw the betrayal coming. The first warning signs appeared quietly. Financial reports contained unusual discrepancies. Revenue projections seemed increasingly optimistic despite market conditions suggesting otherwise. Whenever Emily raised concerns, Daniel always had convincing explanations prepared. And she believed him. Looking back, that trust was the mistake that haunted her most. By the time independent auditors uncovered the truth, millions of dollars had disappeared through a network of fraudulent transactions and concealed liabilities. Investors panicked. Lawsuits followed. Creditors demanded immediate action. News outlets turned the crisis into a public spectacle. The headlines were relentless. Once celebrated as a visionary entrepreneur, Emily suddenly found herself portrayed as either incompetent or complicit. Neither description was true. But truth rarely moves as quickly as scandal. Daniel disappeared before many of the investigations were completed. While authorities eventually confirmed his role in the fraud, the damage had already been done. Investors abandoned the company. Contracts were canceled. Employees lost confidence. Within 18 months, Carter Innovations ceased to exist. The financial loss was devastating. The personal loss was worse. Emily had spent 25 years building something she believed would outlive her. She missed the company, but she missed the people even more. Hundreds of employees had trusted her with their careers. Many had become friends. Watching everything collapse felt less like losing a business and more like attending a funeral that lasted 2 years. The experience affected her personal life as well. Stress consumed every waking hour. Relationships weakened under constant pressure. Friends grew distant. Family members worried but didn't know how to help. The isolation became almost as painful as the failure itself. By the time the bankruptcy proceedings ended, Emily barely recognized the woman she had become. The confident executive who once addressed conference halls filled with thousands of people had been replaced by someone who struggled to answer simple questions about her future. And yet, despite everything, she had survived. The realization came unexpectedly during the mentorship meeting, as she listened to a restaurant owner describe losing nearly everything during a difficult year. He spoke about debt, fear, embarrassment, the feeling that life would never improve. As Emily listened, she suddenly understood something important. For the first time since the collapse, her story might actually help someone else. When the session ended, several participants approached her with questions. The conversations were simple, practical, and surprisingly enjoyable. People weren't interested in her past success. They wanted advice, encouragement, and perspective. For the first time in years, Emily felt useful. As she left the building that evening, a strange sense of purpose followed her into the parking lot. Maybe rebuilding a company wasn't the only way to rebuild a life. Maybe there were other paths forward. She was still thinking about that possibility when she noticed a familiar figure standing near a coffee cart across the street. At first, she assumed she was mistaken. Then the man turned and smiled. Keanu Reeves. Once again, their paths had crossed. This time, however, it didn't feel like an accident. And neither of them was in a hurry to walk away. Emily stopped walking. For a moment, she simply stood there on the sidewalk, wondering whether she was imagining things. Chicago was a large city. The odds of running into the same person twice within a week felt surprisingly small. Yet there he was, standing beside a small coffee cart parked near the curb, holding a paper cup while speaking with the vendor as though he had known him for years. The evening sunlight cast a warm glow across the street, softening the edges of buildings and turning ordinary moments into something almost cinematic. Around him, a few people recognized who he was, but unlike the crowd she had seen in the park, nobody seemed eager to interrupt him. There was a calmness about the scene that felt strangely refreshing. Keanu noticed her almost immediately. His face brightened with recognition. "Birthday coffee." Emily couldn't help laughing. "That's how I'm going to be remembered." It's a memorable introduction. He lifted his cup slightly. "Coffee." The invitation was casual, without pressure or expectation. It wasn't the kind of offer that demanded a decision. It felt more like an opportunity being placed gently on the table. For reasons she couldn't entirely explain, Emily said yes. A few minutes later, they found themselves seated at a small outdoor table beside the cart. The evening air was cool but comfortable, carrying the sounds of distant traffic and conversations drifting through the neighborhood. People passed by without paying much attention, and for the first time in a very long while, Emily found herself sitting across from someone without feeling the need to impress them. That feeling alone was surprisingly rare. For most of her adult life, nearly every conversation had involved business. People wanted investment opportunities, partnerships, introductions, or advice. Even social gatherings often felt connected to professional relationships. It had become difficult to know who genuinely enjoyed her company and who simply enjoyed access to her position. Now that position was gone. And strangely enough, sitting here felt more honest than many of the relationships she had maintained during her years of success. "So," Keanu said, leaning back slightly, "how's the birthday week treating you?" Emily smiled. "I've had worse weeks." "That's progress. Not exactly a high standard. Still counts." The conversation flowed naturally after that. They spoke about the city, favorite restaurants, books they had enjoyed, and places they hoped to visit someday. What surprised Emily most was how little he talked about himself. Whenever the conversation drifted toward his career, he answered politely but briefly before steering attention elsewhere. Most famous people she had met over the years enjoyed being the center of attention. Keanu seemed genuinely more interested in listening. As the evening continued, Emily found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced for years. There was no performance involved, no networking, no hidden agenda. The conversation moved comfortably between lighthearted topics and more thoughtful ones, like two old friends catching up rather than two strangers who had only met days earlier. At one point, Keanu glanced toward the community center across the street. "Were you there for an event?" Emily followed his gaze. "A mentorship program. Teaching. Trying to." He nodded. "You seem like the type who enjoys helping people." The comment caught her off guard. She wasn't sure anyone had described her that way before. Most articles written about her during her career focused on leadership, strategy, ambition, or business growth. Rarely did anyone mention kindness, yet hearing the observation now felt unexpectedly meaningful. "I used to run a company," she said carefully. "Used to." Emily hesitated. Part of her wanted to change the subject. The collapse of Carter Innovations remained painful to discuss. Even after years had passed, certain memories still carried sharp edges, but something about Keanu's presence made honesty feel easier. "It failed." The words hung quietly between them. She expected sympathy, perhaps awkwardness, maybe even curiosity. Instead, he simply nodded. "I know something about starting over." Emily looked at him. His expression remained calm. There was no judgment there. No pity. Just understanding. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than uncomfortable, and Emily realized how rare that was. Most people rushed to fill empty spaces in conversations. They offered solutions before hearing the problem. They searched for clever responses instead of simply listening. Keanu didn't seem interested in doing any of those things. And somehow that made her want to talk. Over the next half hour, she shared more of her story than she had intended. Not every detail, but enough to explain the broad outline of what had happened. She spoke about the company, the betrayal, the bankruptcy, and the loneliness that followed. She described watching people disappear from her life one phone call at a time. Throughout the entire conversation, he never interrupted. He never offered simplistic advice. He simply listened. When she finally finished, the sun had nearly disappeared beyond the skyline. Streetlights flickered on around them. For a moment, Keanu looked out toward the road before turning back toward her. "You know," he said quietly, "people talk a lot about success." Emily nodded. "They do. But success is easy to admire." She waited. "What impresses me is survival." The words settled somewhere deep inside her. No magazine had ever praised her for surviving. No investor had congratulated her for getting back up after losing everything. Most people only celebrated victories. Very few respected endurance. For the first time in years, Emily felt seen. Not for who she had been. Not for what she had owned. Not for the company she built. Simply for the fact that she was still standing. The realization brought an unexpected tightness to her throat. She quickly looked away toward the city lights. Below the growing darkness, cars moved steadily through the streets while windows glowed across dozens of buildings. Life continued everywhere around them. For months, she had felt disconnected from it, as though she were observing the world from behind glass. Tonight felt different. Not dramatically different. Just enough. Enough to remind her that connection was still possible. Enough to make the future seem slightly less empty. Eventually, they stood and prepared to leave. The conversation had lasted nearly 2 hours. Neither of them seemed to realize how quickly the time had passed. As they reached the sidewalk, Keanu pulled a small card from his jacket pocket. "There's a community project I'm visiting next week." Emily accepted the card. "It's nothing fancy, just people helping each other." A smile appeared on his face. "I think you'd like it." She looked down at the address, then back at him. "Are you inviting me?" "I guess I am." For a brief moment, Emily felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Anticipation. Not fear. Not anxiety. Not regret. Just simple curiosity about what might happen next. As they said goodbye and walked in opposite directions, neither realized how important that invitation would become. because the community project wasn't just going to change Emily's week. It was about to change the direction of her entire life. The following Tuesday arrived with clear skies and the first real warmth Chicago had seen in weeks. Emily almost talked herself out of going. She stood in front of her apartment mirror that morning, adjusting the collar of her coat while questioning whether she belonged at the community project Keanu had mentioned. The invitation had seemed natural during their conversation, but now doubt was beginning to creep in. It had been years since she walked into a new environment without a title, a reputation, or a clear purpose. Back when she ran Carter Innovations, confidence came easily. These days, even simple decisions sometimes felt heavier than they should. Still, something inside her refused to stay home. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was loneliness. Or perhaps it was the small spark of hope she had been trying not to acknowledge since meeting him. Whatever the reason, she found herself following the address written on the card. The project occupied an old warehouse that had been transformed into a community resource center. The building itself wasn't impressive from the outside. The brick walls showed signs of age, and the parking lot contained more pickup trucks than luxury vehicles. Yet the moment Emily stepped through the front doors, she sensed something unusual. The place was alive. Volunteers moved between rooms carrying supplies. Local business owners spoke with young entrepreneurs around folding tables. Retired teachers offered free tutoring sessions in one corner while volunteers organized food donations in another. Conversations filled the air. Laughter echoed through hallways. The entire building seemed powered by people helping one another. Emily stood near the entrance for several moments, simply taking it all in. Nobody cared about status here. Nobody asked who had money. Nobody seemed interested in titles. People were valued for what they contributed, not what they owned. The realization felt surprisingly refreshing. "Glad you came." She turned and saw Keanu approaching with a friendly smile. He looked exactly as he had the previous week: simple jeans, work boots, and a jacket that made him blend effortlessly into the crowd. "I almost didn't," Emily admitted. "Most worthwhile things begin with almost." She laughed. "Do you always talk like that?" "Only when coffee isn't available." The answer made her smile again. It was becoming easier around him. Far easier than she expected. Over the next several hours, Emily helped wherever she was needed. At first, the task seemed small: organizing paperwork, answering questions, reviewing business plans submitted by aspiring entrepreneurs. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would ever appear in a magazine. Yet something unexpected happened. She enjoyed it. One young woman approached her with a proposal for a bakery she hoped to open. Another man shared plans for a landscaping company he was struggling to expand. As Emily reviewed their ideas, old instincts began returning naturally. She spotted financial weaknesses, suggested marketing improvements, identified risks they hadn't considered. For the first time in years, her experience felt valuable again. Not because it generated profit, because it helped someone. By the end of the afternoon, several participants were thanking her for advice that took only minutes to provide. The gratitude felt genuine in a way she hadn't experienced during much of her corporate career. On her drive home that evening, Emily realized something important. She had spent nearly 6 hours without thinking about her failures. That hadn't happened in years. The following weeks brought more changes. She began volunteering regularly at the center. Every Tuesday and Thursday she worked with struggling entrepreneurs, helping them avoid mistakes she once made herself. Word spread quickly. Soon people specifically requested meetings with her. They respected her knowledge. They appreciated her honesty. Most importantly, they didn't judge her past. Many of them had experienced failure themselves. Some were rebuilding after bankruptcy. Others were recovering from divorce, illness, or personal loss. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, Emily found herself surrounded by people who understood that success wasn't permanent and failure wasn't final. The experience slowly began changing her. The apartment still looked the same. The bills still arrived. Her bank account remained painfully small. But something inside her was improving. Hope had quietly returned. Not all at once. Just a little at a time. One evening, after finishing another mentoring session, Emily stopped at a grocery store on her way home. As she pushed a cart through the aisles, she caught herself humming softly beneath her breath. The sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she had done that. For months, maybe years, life had felt like survival. Now, for brief moments, it felt like living again. That night, she sat beside her apartment window, holding a cup of coffee while watching lights appear across the city skyline. The familiar photograph from her old office remained beside the window, but it no longer carried the same weight it once had. For years, she viewed that picture as a reminder of everything she lost. Tonight, it looked more like proof of everything she had accomplished. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. Sometimes healing begins with the smallest change in perspective. Unfortunately, life wasn't finished testing her. 3 weeks later, the setback arrived. It happened on an ordinary Friday afternoon. Emily had just returned from a meeting at the community center when she noticed an envelope sticking out beneath her apartment door. At first, she assumed it was another bill or advertisement. Then she saw the return address. Her stomach tightened immediately. The letter came from attorneys representing one of the remaining creditors connected to the Carter Innovations bankruptcy proceedings. Her hands felt cold as she opened it. The legal language filled several pages, but the message became clear within moments. A previously unresolved claim had resurfaced. The creditor believed additional financial responsibility remained attached to decisions made during the company's final months. Whether the claim would succeed in court remained uncertain, but responding would require legal representation. Legal representation cost money. Money she didn't have. Emily sank slowly into a chair. For several minutes, she simply stared at the documents. The room felt smaller. The air felt heavier. All the progress she had made over the past month suddenly seemed fragile. She had worked so hard to move forward, to rebuild, to stop living inside the shadow of her collapse. And now the past was reaching for her again. The fear wasn't just financial. It was emotional. She knew what prolonged legal battles could do. She knew how quickly stress could consume every waking thought. Most of all, she feared being dragged backward into a chapter of her life she desperately wanted to leave behind. That evening, she walked through the city for nearly 2 hours trying to clear her mind. The streets were crowded with people beginning their weekends. Restaurants buzzed with activity. Couples laughed together as they passed beneath glowing storefronts. Yet Emily barely noticed any of it. Her thoughts remained fixed on the letter, on the uncertainty, on the possibility that everything she had started rebuilding might collapse once again. As darkness settled across the city, she eventually found herself sitting alone on a bench overlooking the river. The wind moved gently across the water. Boats drifted beneath distant bridges. Chicago's skyline sparkled against the night. Ordinarily, she found comfort in the view. Tonight it brought little peace. For the first time in weeks, the old hopelessness had returned. And she didn't know what to do next. Then her phone vibrated. A text message appeared on the screen. It was from Keanu. Only 4 words. "How are you doing?" Emily stared at the message longer than she intended. The timing felt almost impossible, as though somehow he had sensed something was wrong. She looked out across the dark water before slowly typing a reply. A simple answer, but one that carried far more truth than she usually allowed herself to share. Honestly, not very well. Within seconds, 3 dots appeared on the screen. And whatever came next was about to change everything. Emily sat motionless on the bench overlooking the river while the glow from her phone illuminated her face. Around her, Chicago continued moving as though nothing had happened. Cars crossed distant bridges. Lights reflected across the dark water. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted from a restaurant patio. Yet her attention remained fixed on the message screen. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, a response arrived. "Want to talk?" Emily stared at the words for several seconds. It was such a simple question, yet it felt strangely unfamiliar. Over the past few years, most people hadn't asked how she was doing, and when they did, they rarely waited for an honest answer. She looked back toward the river before typing slowly. "I don't even know where to start." The reply came almost immediately. "Start anywhere." For reasons she couldn't explain, that answer made her smile. 20 minutes later, she found herself sitting across from Keanu in a small diner that overlooked the water. The place was quiet, nearly empty except for a few late-night customers and an elderly couple sharing pie near the window. Soft music played in the background while coffee brewed somewhere behind the counter. Emily wrapped both hands around a warm mug and tried to organize her thoughts. "I got a letter today." Keanu nodded. "The legal kind." She looked surprised. "How did you know?" "Because that's the face people make when paperwork ruins their day." Despite everything, she laughed. The sound felt good. It broke some of the tension that had been building inside her chest since afternoon. Over the next several minutes, she explained the situation: the unresolved creditor claim, the possibility of new legal expenses, the fear of being pulled back into years of stress and uncertainty. By the time she finished, her coffee had gone cold again. Keanu listened exactly the way he always did. Without interrupting, without rushing, without pretending to have all the answers. When she finally stopped speaking, he remained quiet for a moment. Then he asked a question she hadn't expected. "What scares you most?" Emily frowned slightly. "The lawsuit." "Does it?" She looked at him. He wasn't challenging her. He was genuinely asking. After several seconds, she lowered her eyes toward the table. "No." The answer surprised even her. "What scares me most is starting over again." The words came out softer than intended. "I finally feel like I'm making progress. I finally stopped thinking about my failure every hour of every day, and now it feels like the past is reaching back for me." Outside the window, headlights reflected across the river. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Emily." She looked up. "Do you know what I've noticed about you?" She shook her head. "You keep talking about rebuilding your life like it hasn't already started." The comment caught her off guard. Before she could respond, he continued. "You help people twice a week. That's volunteering. You changed a bakery owner's financial plan last month." Emily blinked. "How do you know that?" "The bakery owner told me." A smile appeared. "She thinks you're a genius." Emily rolled her eyes despite herself. "That's an exaggeration." "Maybe." He shrugged. "But you've helped a lot of people recently." The waitress arrived with fresh coffee before either of them spoke again. After she left, Emily stared down at the rising steam. Part of her wanted to dismiss his words. Part of her wanted to believe them. The second part was winning. "You know what the strange thing is?" she asked. "What?" "When my company collapsed, I thought losing the business was the worst thing that could happen." Keanu waited. "Now I'm not so sure." She glanced toward the window. "I think losing my sense of purpose was worse." The realization settled heavily between them. Because it was true. Money could be earned again. Companies could be rebuilt. But purpose was different. Purpose gave shape to ordinary days. Purpose made struggle meaningful. And for years, Emily had lived without it. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. By the time they left the diner, the city had grown quiet. The air felt cooler, the streets less crowded. And although her legal problems remained unresolved, something inside her felt lighter. Not because the situation had changed, because her perspective had. Sometimes burdens become easier to carry when someone helps you hold them for a while. The following week brought new challenges. The attorneys confirmed that the creditor claim would require formal review. Legal meetings were scheduled. Documents needed gathering. Old financial records had to be examined. Every file forced Emily to revisit memories she would rather forget. There were days when she questioned whether moving forward was worth the effort. Days when the old hopelessness returned. Days when she stared at her apartment ceiling late at night wondering if life would ever feel stable again. Yet each time doubt appeared, something unexpected happened. The people she had been helping began showing up for her. A restaurant owner she had advised sent an encouraging message. A young entrepreneur brought coffee before one of her meetings. Another former mentee dropped off flowers with a handwritten note thanking her for helping save his business. The gestures were small, but together they mattered. For years, Emily believed leadership meant standing at the front. Now she was learning that real impact often revealed itself quietly. One person at a time. Then came the opportunity. It arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon during a mentoring session. A representative from a regional business development organization visited the community center to observe the program. His name was Robert Ellis, and he spent most of the afternoon listening as mentors worked with entrepreneurs. Near the end of the day, he approached Emily. "I've heard your name several times." She smiled politely. "Hopefully for good reasons." "Very good reasons." He handed her a business card. "We run a program that helps struggling small businesses recover and grow." Emily glanced at the card. The organization operated across multiple states. "We're expanding," Robert continued, "and we're looking for someone to lead a new advisory division." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "Lead? We need someone who understands both success and failure." The words immediately caught her attention. Most companies hired people because of victories. Very few valued lessons learned from defeat. Robert smiled. "Frankly, your experience makes you uniquely qualified." For a moment, Emily couldn't speak. The possibility seemed almost unreal. After years of rejection letters, ignored applications, and closed doors, someone was offering an opportunity based on everything she had survived. Not despite it. Because of it. That distinction changed everything. "We'd like you to consider the position." He handed her additional information. "Take your time." After he left, Emily remained seated at the table staring at the documents. Her heart was racing. Not from fear. From possibility. The feeling was unfamiliar. Dangerously unfamiliar. Because hope always carried risk. Hope created expectations. Hope invited disappointment. Yet deep inside, she felt something awakening that had been dormant for years. Belief. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave, she noticed a text message waiting on her phone. It was from Keanu. "How did today go?" Emily looked down at the job information in her hands. A slow smile spread across her face. Then she typed back, "I think something important just happened." What she didn't realize was that this opportunity would become the turning point she had been searching for. And for the first time in a very long time, the future looked bigger than her past. The drive home felt different that evening. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't staring at the road while worrying about bills, legal problems, or mistakes she couldn't change. Instead, her thoughts kept returning to the folder resting on the passenger seat beside her. Every red light seemed to tempt her into opening it again. Every mile brought another wave of cautious excitement. The opportunity Robert Ellis had described wasn't just another consulting role or temporary contract. It was a chance to build something meaningful. More importantly, it was a chance to use everything she had learned from both success and failure. For years, employers saw only the collapse of Carter Innovations. They saw the headlines, the bankruptcy, and the controversy. Robert had seen something different. He had seen experience. That distinction mattered more than she could explain. When she arrived home, the apartment felt unusually quiet. The same worn furniture stood where it always had. The same refrigerator rattled every few minutes. The same stack of unopened advertisements sat near the kitchen counter. Nothing around her had changed. Yet somehow everything felt different. Emily placed the folder on the table and sat beside the window. As evening settled across the city, she slowly reviewed every page. The organization planned to expand support services for struggling small businesses across several states. They wanted someone capable of building mentoring systems, advising entrepreneurs, and creating recovery programs for companies facing financial challenges. With every paragraph she read, her excitement grew. This wasn't just work. It felt personal. For years, she had wondered whether her experience still held value. Now someone was offering proof that it did. That night, she slept better than she had in months. The following weeks moved quickly. Interviews were scheduled. Additional meetings followed. Robert introduced her to executives, board members, and program directors. Every conversation seemed to reinforce the same idea. They weren't interested in hearing a perfect success story. They wanted someone who understood resilience. Someone who knew what it felt like to lose everything and keep going. Emily found that refreshing. For the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel pressure to hide parts of her past. She spoke openly about Carter innovations, about the betrayal, and about the lessons learned during the collapse. Instead of judging her, people listened. Some even seemed inspired by her honesty. The experience gradually restored something she hadn't realized was missing. Confidence. Not the confidence she possessed during her corporate years. That version had been tied to achievement, status, and financial success. This confidence felt quieter, stronger, built on survival rather than recognition. One afternoon, after completing another interview, Emily stopped by the community center. Several entrepreneurs were waiting for her weekly mentoring session, and as she walked through the doors, something unexpected happened. People greeted her by name. Not because she was famous, not because she was wealthy, because they were genuinely happy to see her. A bakery owner waved from across the room. The young landscaping entrepreneur she had advised months earlier hurried over to share news about a new contract. Another small business owner proudly announced that her shop had become profitable for the first time in nearly 2 years. Each story felt like a victory. Not their victory, their shared victory. Emily listened to them speak, and for a moment she felt an emotion she hadn't experienced since the earliest days of building Carter Innovations. Pride, the healthy kind, the kind that comes from helping others succeed. As the session ended, several participants gathered around her table, continuing conversations long after the official program finished. Watching them laugh together, Emily realized something remarkable. She had found a community. Not employees, not investors, not business contacts. People, real people. And somewhere along the way, they had become important to her. That realization stayed with her throughout the evening. Later that night, she received a call from Robert. The moment she saw his name on the screen, her heart began racing. She answered immediately. "Hello, Emily." His voice sounded cheerful. "Do you have a minute?" She laughed nervously. "That depends. Is this a good call or a bad call?" "It's a very good call." Her grip tightened around the phone. Robert didn't keep her waiting. The organization wanted her. The board had approved the position unanimously. The advisory division would be hers to build. For several seconds, Emily couldn't speak. She simply sat in silence while the words settled into reality. After years of rejection, after years of rebuilding, after years of wondering whether anyone would ever trust her professionally again, someone finally had. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. When the call ended, she remained seated in the darkness of her apartment. The city lights glowed outside her window. Cars moved along distant streets. Life continued as it always had. Yet for Emily, everything had changed. A slow knock interrupted her thoughts. Confused, she checked the clock. Nearly 9 o'clock. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she found a delivery driver holding a small package. "Emily Carter's?" "Yes." The driver handed over the box and left. There was no company logo. No explanation. Only her name written neatly across the top. Curious, she carried it inside. The package wasn't large. Inside, she found a simple ceramic coffee mug. Nothing expensive, nothing extravagant, just a beautifully crafted mug with a short message engraved along the side. To new beginnings. Emily stared at the words. A small card rested beneath the mug. She immediately recognized the handwriting. Congratulations, you earned this, K. For a long moment, she simply sat there holding the gift. The gesture wasn't grand. It wasn't flashy. Yet somehow it meant more than many expensive presents she had received during her years as a CEO. Because it wasn't celebrating wealth. It wasn't celebrating status. It was celebrating her. The woman who had survived. The woman who kept going. The woman who refused to quit. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, tears slipped down her cheeks. Not tears of sadness. Not even tears of relief. Something deeper. The kind of emotion that appears when someone sees your struggle and acknowledges it. The kind of emotion that arrives when you realize you haven't been fighting alone. Emily carried the mug to the kitchen and placed it beside the old photograph from her first office. The two objects looked strangely perfect together. One represented who she had been. The other represented who she was becoming. For years, she believed her story had ended when her company collapsed. Now she was beginning to understand the truth. That chapter had only been the middle, not the ending. As she stood by the window holding a fresh cup of coffee, her phone buzzed. Another message from Keanu. Celebrating tonight. Emily smiled. Then she typed back. Trying to. His reply arrived seconds later. Good, you deserve to. She looked out across the city skyline and felt warmth spread through her chest. The future no longer felt frightening. It felt open, full of possibilities she hadn't dared imagine. What Emily didn't realize was that the biggest changes were still ahead. Because somewhere between shared conversations, quiet encouragement, and unexpected kindness, something else had started growing. Something neither of them had spoken about. Yet, and before long, neither of them would be able to ignore it anymore. Spring arrived quietly. The harsh winter winds disappeared little by little, replaced by warmer afternoons and longer evenings. Trees throughout the city began showing signs of new life, and people seemed happier simply because sunlight lingered a little longer each day. For Emily, however, the season felt significant for another reason. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to the future. Her new position had officially begun several weeks earlier, and the work suited her perfectly. Every day brought new challenges, but they were challenges she welcomed. She spent her time helping struggling businesses recover, mentoring entrepreneurs, and building programs designed to support people facing the same kinds of setbacks she once endured. The work was demanding, meaningful, and deeply personal. Many mornings she arrived before anyone else and left long after sunset. Yet unlike the exhausting years at Carter Innovations, this work energized her. She wasn't chasing growth charts or investor approval anymore. She was helping people rebuild their lives. And that made every long day worthwhile. Meanwhile, her friendship with Keanu continued growing in ways neither of them seemed eager to define. It happened naturally. A shared coffee after work. A phone call that lasted longer than expected. An afternoon spent visiting one of the community projects together. Neither of them planned these moments. They simply happened, and somehow they became part of everyday life. One Saturday morning, they volunteered at a neighborhood renovation project organized through the community center. The goal was simple: help repair several homes owned by elderly residents who could no longer afford major maintenance. Emily arrived expecting a few hours of painting. Instead, she found herself laughing more than she had in months. The volunteers worked together like family. People shared stories, traded jokes, and helped one another without keeping score. Throughout the day, Emily noticed something about Keanu that continued surprising her. No matter where he went, he made people feel important. Not through grand gestures. Through attention. He listened when others spoke. Remembered details from previous conversations. Asked questions and genuinely cared about the answers. Watching him interact with people reminded Emily of something she rarely encountered during her years in business. Humility. True humility. Not the kind people performed for public appearances. The real kind. The kind that existed even when nobody was watching. Late that afternoon, after most volunteers had gone home, Emily and Keanu sat on the front porch of one of the completed houses drinking bottled water while enjoying the cool evening air. The elderly homeowner had spent the entire day thanking everyone repeatedly. Her gratitude still lingered in the atmosphere. "You look happy." The comment came unexpectedly. Emily turned toward him. "What makes you say that?" Keanu smiled. "Because 6 months ago, you looked like someone carrying the entire world on her shoulders. And now you look lighter." Emily considered the observation. Part of her wanted to dismiss it. But she couldn't. Because he was right. Life wasn't perfect. The legal situation still existed. Financially, she wasn't fully recovered. Certain wounds remained. Yet something fundamental had changed. She no longer woke up every morning expecting disappointment. Hope had become stronger than fear. And perhaps the biggest reason for that sat beside her on the porch. The realization caught her off guard. She quickly looked away toward the street. Children played basketball nearby while neighbors talked across front yards. The scene felt peaceful in a way modern life rarely allowed. "I owe you a lot." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Keanu frowned slightly. "No, you don't." "I do." He shook his head. "Emily, everything you've accomplished recently belongs to you." "Maybe." She hesitated. "But you showed up when nobody else did." For several moments, neither spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt honest. Eventually, Keanu looked toward the sunset glowing beyond the neighborhood rooftops. Everyone needs someone sometimes. The simplicity of the answer somehow made it more meaningful. Emily felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. Not excitement. Not attraction alone. Something deeper. Trust. The kind built slowly over time. The kind that survives difficult days. The kind she thought she had lost forever after the collapse of her company. Over the following weeks, their connection continued deepening. Friends at the community center began noticing. Not because of anything obvious. Neither of them flirted openly. Neither behaved like a couple. Yet there was something unmistakable in the way they looked at each other. Something quiet. Something growing. One evening after a fundraising event, several volunteers gathered for dinner at a small restaurant near the river. The atmosphere was relaxed and cheerful. Stories flowed easily. Laughter filled the room. At one point, Emily stepped away from the table to answer a phone call. When she returned several minutes later, she noticed something amusing. The seat beside Keanu remained empty despite every other chair being occupied. Someone had intentionally saved it for her. The realization made her smile. She sat down. Across the table, a volunteer named Sarah raised an eyebrow. The expression said everything words didn't. Emily immediately looked away. Yet she couldn't stop smiling. Neither could Keanu. For the rest of the evening, a strange awareness lingered between them. Nothing changed. Yet everything felt different. As summer approached, Emily's professional life continued improving. The advisory division expanded successfully. More businesses joined the program. Her work began receiving recognition throughout the region. People respected her again. Not because of her past success. Because of the impact she was creating now. Ironically, the more successful she became, the less interested she felt in recognition. The things she valued most had changed. Relationships mattered more. Purpose mattered more. People mattered more. One evening, after a particularly successful week, Emily invited Keanu to dinner at her apartment. It wasn't fancy. Homemade pasta. Fresh bread from the bakery owned by one of her former mentees. Coffee afterwards served in the ceramic mug he had given her months earlier. The evening felt simple, comfortable, real. As darkness settled outside the window, they found themselves sitting at the kitchen table long after dinner had ended. Conversation drifted naturally from childhood memories to regrets, dreams, and lessons learned through difficult years. At some point, neither remembered exactly when, the room grew quiet. Not awkwardly quiet, meaningfully quiet. Emily looked across the table. Keanu met her gaze. For a brief moment, neither looked away. Something important hovered there. Something both of them felt. The distance between friendship and something more suddenly seemed much smaller than before. Emily's heart beat faster. Not from uncertainty, from awareness. And judging by the expression in his eyes, he felt it too. Yet neither spoke. Neither crossed the line. Neither risked changing what they already had. Eventually, the moment passed. Conversation resumed. The evening continued. But the feeling remained. Long after he left. Long after the dishes were washed. Long after the apartment became quiet again. Standing beside her window later that night, Emily looked out across the city lights and realized a truth she wasn't quite ready to admit. She cared about him, far more than she intended, far more than she expected. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it felt surprisingly natural. Yet one question continued lingering in the back of her mind. Did he feel the same way? For now, neither of them was willing to ask. And that unanswered question was about to become impossible to ignore. By the middle of summer, Emily's life barely resembled the one she had been living a year earlier. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been no dramatic rescue, no miraculous breakthrough, and no sudden return to wealth. Instead, change had arrived the way most meaningful things do, slowly, quietly, and one day at a time. Looking back, she could trace dozens of small moments that had carried her from hopelessness to possibility. A conversation in a park, an invitation to a community center, a chance to help someone else before she fully knew how to help herself. Now those moments had become a new life. The advisory division she had been hired to build was thriving beyond expectations. Businesses that once stood on the edge of collapse were recovering. Several had expanded. Others had hired new employees. Local newspapers began publishing stories about the program's success, and community leaders regularly invited Emily to speak at events focused on entrepreneurship and economic recovery. The attention felt strange. Not unpleasant. Just unfamiliar. Years earlier, she had measured success through numbers, profits, and market value. Now success looked different. It looked like a restaurant owner paying off debt. It looked like a single mother keeping her bookstore open. It looked like families holding on to businesses that otherwise would have disappeared. Those victories mattered more than any headline ever had. One Thursday afternoon, Emily finished speaking at a regional business conference and stepped into the hotel lobby carrying a folder of notes. Dozens of attendees had approached afterward to thank her for sharing her story. Several had spoken openly about their own failures, explaining how her honesty gave them courage to keep going. The experience left her emotional. For years, she had viewed the collapse of Carter Innovations as the worst chapter of her life. Now she was beginning to understand that it had also become one of her greatest sources of wisdom. As she exited the building, she spotted a familiar figure leaning casually against a nearby railing. Keanu. He held 2 coffee cups. Emily laughed immediately. You have incredible timing. I've been told that. He handed her one of the cups. I thought successful speakers deserved coffee. Successful speakers. A smile spread across her face. You realize I spent half that presentation talking about failure. Exactly. His eyes sparkled with amusement. Which is why people listened. Together they began walking through the city streets while the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk. It had become one of their favorite routines. No destination, no schedule, just conversation. Somehow, those simple walks had become the best part of her week. As they moved through downtown, Emily noticed something she had stopped noticing months ago. People recognized her. Not everywhere. Not constantly. But often enough. A bookstore owner waved from across the street. A former mentee shouted hello from a passing truck. Several conference attendees smiled as they walked by. For years, being recognized would have fed her ego. Now it simply reminded her how interconnected life really was. The people waving weren't interested in her reputation. They appreciated her impact. And that difference meant everything. Later that evening, they stopped at a small park overlooking Lake Michigan. The water stretched endlessly toward the horizon while sailboats drifted beneath a sky painted with shades of gold and orange. Emily sat on a bench and watched the waves. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence felt familiar now. Comfortable. The kind that exists only between people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Eventually, Keanu broke it. You know something. What? You look different. Emily laughed. That's not very specific. I'm serious. He turned toward her. The first time I saw you, you looked like someone carrying years of disappointment. The memory immediately returned. Her birthday. The rain. The loneliness. The feeling that life had already passed her by. It felt like a completely different lifetime. And now, she asked softly. Keanu smiled. Now you look like yourself. The words settled deep inside her. Because despite everything she had accomplished recently, she hadn't fully realized how much she had changed. For years, she had been surviving. Now she was living. The distinction seemed simple. But it wasn't. It was everything. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon, Emily found herself studying the man sitting beside her. She noticed the kindness in his eyes, the patience in the way he listened, the quiet strength that never demanded attention. What struck her most wasn't that he had entered her life during its darkest chapter. It was that he had stayed. Many people had appeared during her successful years. Very few remained after the collapse. Keanu had met her when she had nothing to offer. No influence. No wealth. No status. And somehow that made his presence more meaningful than anyone else's. A realization began forming inside her. One she had been avoiding for months. One she could no longer ignore. She loved him. The truth arrived with surprising calmness. Not like lightning. Not like fireworks. More like the slow sunrise after a long night. Steady. Certain. Inevitable. For several moments, she simply sat there absorbing the realization. The strange thing was that it didn't frighten her. What frightened her was what came next. Did he feel the same way? The question lingered in her mind long after they left the park. Over the following weeks, it became impossible to escape. Every shared conversation, every inside joke, every thoughtful message, every moment they spent together seemed to reinforce what she already knew. Her feelings weren't temporary. They weren't confusion. They weren't gratitude mistaken for affection. They were real. And judging by the way he looked at her sometimes, she suspected she wasn't alone. Yet neither of them spoke about it. Both seemed content preserving what already existed rather than risking it. At least for now. Then came the event that changed everything. Near the end of August, the community center organized a celebration honoring volunteers, mentors, and local business owners who had contributed to the program's growth. Hundreds of people attended. The atmosphere felt festive and joyful. Stories were shared. Achievements were recognized. Lives rebuilt through the program were celebrated. Toward the end of the evening, organizers surprised Emily with a special recognition award. As she stood before the audience accepting it, applause filled the room. People rose to their feet. Some wiped away tears. Others smiled proudly. The moment should have felt overwhelming. Instead, Emily's eyes searched the crowd. And found him. Keanu stood near the back of the room. Applauding. Smiling. Looking happier than anyone else there. In that instant, Emily understood something that mattered far more than the award in her hands. Every major step forward in her new life carried traces of his encouragement. Not because he solved her problems, because he believed in her when she struggled to believe in herself. Later that night, after the event ended and guests slowly departed, Emily found herself standing alone outside beneath a sky filled with stars. The award rested in her hands. The parking lot had nearly emptied. A warm breeze moved through the trees. Then footsteps approached behind her. She turned. Keanu. Neither spoke immediately. The moment felt too important, too fragile, too honest. Finally, he looked at her and smiled. "You deserved that." Emily stared at him for several seconds. Then she answered with complete sincerity. "I wouldn't be standing here without you." Something shifted in his expression. Something deeper than friendship. Something neither of them could hide anymore. Yet before either found the courage to say what they truly felt, another voice called from across the parking lot. The moment broke. The conversation ended, and the words both wanted to say remained trapped between them. But not for much longer. Because life was about to force a decision, neither of them could postpone. September arrived carrying the first hints of autumn. The mornings felt cooler. Leaves along the city streets began changing color, and a gentle crispness settled into the air. For most people, the seasonal shift barely registered. For Emily, however, it seemed to mirror the transformation taking place in her own life. A year earlier, she had dreaded waking up each morning. Now she looked forward to it. The difference still amazed her sometimes. There were moments when she would catch herself smiling during an ordinary workday and wonder how she had arrived here. Not because life had become perfect. Challenges still existed. Problems still appeared. The legal claim connected to Carter Innovations had not completely disappeared. But those struggles no longer defined her. For years, Emily's identity had been tied to loss. Now it was tied to purpose. And that changed everything. The advisory division continued exceeding expectations. More communities joined the program. Local governments began requesting partnerships. Small business owners who once faced bankruptcy were now mentoring others. What started as a modest initiative had grown into something genuinely meaningful. One Monday morning, Robert Ellis entered her office carrying a thick folder and a smile she recognized immediately. Whenever Robert looked that pleased, it usually meant more work. Or a bigger opportunity. Sometimes both. "I have news." Emily laughed. "Good news or stressful news?" "Depends on how much you enjoy success." That answer immediately made her suspicious. Robert placed the folder on her desk and sat down. "The board met last week." Emily waited. "They want to expand nationally." For a moment, she simply stared at him. The words seemed too large to process. Nationally. The advisory division she helped build was no longer being viewed as a regional success. It had become a model other organizations wanted to replicate. Robert opened the folder. Inside were expansion plans, projected budgets, staffing proposals, and strategic outlines covering multiple states. Then he delivered the part she wasn't expecting. "They want you to lead it." Silence filled the office. Outside the window, traffic moved through downtown Chicago while sunlight reflected from nearby buildings. Inside, Emily felt her heartbeat quicken. The offer represented everything she had worked toward. A larger role, greater impact, a chance to help thousands more entrepreneurs rebuild their lives. Professionally, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Yet instead of immediate excitement, something else appeared. Uncertainty. Because the position came with conditions. Travel, extensive commitments, possible relocation, long periods away from Chicago. The realization settled heavily in her chest. Chicago wasn't just a city anymore. It had become home again. More importantly, it was where the people she cared about lived, including one person in particular. Robert noticed her hesitation. "Take your time." She nodded slowly. I will. For the rest of the day, she struggled to focus. The opportunity should have been an easy decision. A few years earlier, she would have accepted immediately without a second thought. Back then, ambition always came first. Now life felt more complicated, or perhaps more meaningful. That evening, she found herself walking along the river with Keanu. The city lights reflected across the water while boats drifted slowly beneath illuminated bridges. It had become one of their favorite places to talk, especially when something important weighed on their minds. Keanu noticed her mood almost immediately. Something happened. It wasn't a question. Emily smiled. You always know. You get a certain look. What kind of look? The kind people get when they're carrying around a decision. She laughed softly. Then she told him everything. The expansion. The promotion. The responsibility. The possibility of leaving Chicago. As she spoke, Keanu listened quietly. When she finished, he rested his arms against the railing overlooking the river. That's incredible. It is. You deserve it. Emily looked toward the water. Then why does it feel so complicated? For a long moment, neither spoke. The answer seemed obvious. Yet neither wanted to be the first to say it. Finally, Keanu smiled slightly. Maybe because success isn't the only thing that matters anymore. The words landed with surprising force. Because they were true. Years ago, Emily would have measured every decision through the lens of achievement. Now she measured them differently. Relationships, purpose, belonging, those things mattered too. Perhaps more than she ever realized. The conversation eventually shifted to other topics, but the question remained between them. Neither could escape it. And over the following weeks, it became impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, their friendship continued deepening in ways that felt both wonderful and dangerous. They spent more time together than ever before. Coffee became dinner. Dinner became weekend plans. Weekend plans became traditions. Neither acknowledged the obvious truth. Yet everyone around them noticed. One afternoon, Sarah from the community center cornered Emily after a meeting. Can I ask you something? Emily immediately narrowed her eyes. That depends. Sarah grinned. When exactly are you two going to stop pretending? Emily nearly choked on her coffee. Pretending what? Sarah stared at her. The look alone provided the answer. Emily felt her face grow warm. We're friends. Of course. The response contained enough sarcasm to fill an entire building. Emily laughed despite herself. Yet later that evening, she found herself thinking about the conversation. Because beneath the teasing lay an uncomfortable truth. The line between friendship and something more had already blurred. Both of them knew it. Neither seemed willing to cross it. Perhaps because they feared ruining what already existed. Or perhaps because what existed had become too valuable to risk. Then came the legal update. The call arrived unexpectedly on a Thursday morning. Emily listened carefully while her attorney explained the situation. When the conversation ended, she sat quietly for several minutes. The creditor claim was officially resolved. Dismissed. Finished. After years of uncertainty, the final major shadow from Carter Innovations had disappeared. The chapter was over. Completely over. For the first time in nearly a decade, nothing tied her to the collapse anymore. No lawsuits. No investigations. No lingering threats. Freedom. The realization left her emotional. That evening, she called the one person she wanted to tell first. An hour later, she and Keanu sat together on a bench overlooking the lake, while the sun slowly disappeared beneath the horizon. The sky glowed orange and gold. Waves rolled gently against the shoreline. For several minutes, they simply sat there enjoying the moment. Then Emily spoke. It's finally over. Keanu looked at her. She didn't need to explain. He understood immediately. A smile spread across his face, the kind of smile shared by someone who had witnessed every difficult step of the journey. "I'm happy for you." Emily swallowed hard. "So am I." The words sounded simple, yet they carried years of pain, healing, and perseverance. As darkness settled around them, neither seemed eager to leave. The conversation slowed. The silence returned. Comfortable, meaningful, dangerously intimate. For one brief moment, Emily thought he might say something. Something important. Something that had remained unspoken for months. Instead, his phone rang. The moment disappeared. Once again, the words stayed trapped between them. Yet this time felt different, because both of them knew a decision was approaching. Not just about her career. About them. Sooner or later, one of them would have to choose. Whether to protect the friendship they cherished, or risk everything for the possibility of something even greater. And neither of them could avoid that choice much longer. Some decisions arrive suddenly. Others spend months quietly approaching until they can no longer be ignored. For Emily Carter, the moment of truth arrived on an ordinary October afternoon. The trees throughout Chicago had turned brilliant shades of gold and red. Leaves drifted across sidewalks while cool winds swept through the city. Everywhere she looked, nature seemed to be preparing for change. In many ways, so was she. The national expansion proposal remained on her desk. The board wanted an answer. Soon, every day brought another email, another meeting, another reminder that an important decision could not be postponed forever. Professionally, accepting the position made perfect sense. The opportunity was extraordinary. The impact would be enormous. The challenge excited her. Yet every time she imagined leaving Chicago, a familiar heaviness settled into her chest. Because the city was no longer just where she lived. It had become where she healed. And where he was. The realization felt impossible to ignore now. Months earlier, Emily had convinced herself that friendship was enough. She told herself she was grateful simply to have someone she trusted, someone who listened, someone who stayed. But somewhere between shared coffees, late-night conversations, and countless quiet moments, gratitude had become something else. Something deeper. Something she could no longer pretend not to feel. She loved him, and for the first time, she was tired of carrying that truth alone. The opportunity to speak finally arrived a few days later. The community center was hosting its annual autumn fundraiser, one of the largest events of the year. Volunteers, business owners, donors, and community leaders filled the building. Laughter echoed through the hallways. Music played softly in the background. Tables overflowed with food donated by local restaurants that had once benefited from the mentoring program. Watching the crowd, Emily felt overwhelmed by how much had changed. A year ago, she had spent her birthday sitting alone in a bakery, wondering whether anyone remembered she existed. Now she stood surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had become connected to hers. The contrast was almost impossible to comprehend. As the evening progressed, countless people stopped to thank her. Some shared stories of businesses saved. Others spoke about confidence regained. Several admitted that hearing her story had helped them survive difficult periods in their own lives. Each conversation touched her deeply. Yet despite everything happening around her, her eyes kept searching for one person. And eventually, they found him. Keanu stood near the back of the room speaking with several volunteers. The moment he noticed her looking in his direction, he smiled. That smile still affected her more than she cared to admit. Perhaps it always would. Later that evening, after most guests had left, volunteers remained behind to clean up. Tables were folded, decorations were removed, boxes were carried towards storage rooms. By the time everything finished, the building had become quiet. Almost empty. Emily stepped outside for fresh air. The night was cool. Above her, stars shone faintly beyond the city lights. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and walked toward a nearby courtyard behind the building. A few moments later, footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn around. She already knew who it was. Long night. Keanu's voice carried the familiar warmth she had come to cherish. Emily smiled. Successful night. It was. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence felt different tonight. Not uncomfortable. Not uncertain. Important. As though both sensed something was about to change. Finally, Emily took a slow breath. There's something I need to tell you. The words surprised even her. For months, she had rehearsed dozens of versions of this conversation. Now that it had arrived, simplicity felt easier than perfection. Keanu looked at her carefully. The expression in his eyes immediately told her he understood the significance of what was happening. You can tell me anything. Her heart pounded. For a brief moment, fear tried to stop her. Fear of rejection. Fear of embarrassment. Fear of losing one of the most meaningful relationships she had ever known. Then she remembered something important. The woman sitting alone on her birthday had spent too much of her life allowing fear to make decisions. She wasn't that woman anymore. So she told the truth. When my company collapsed, I thought I lost everything. Her voice remained steady. I lost my career, my reputation, friends, confidence. She looked down briefly before continuing. And then I met you. The courtyard seemed impossibly quiet. Even the wind felt still. You never treated me like a failure. Emotion tightened her throat. You never asked what I could do for you. A small smile appeared. You just showed up. Keanu didn't move. Didn't interrupt. Didn't look away. Emily felt tears gathering in her eyes. Not because she was sad. Because she was finally saying what had lived inside her heart for months. I don't know what happens next. She laughed softly. Honestly, I've spent years being terrible at predicting the future. The smile faded. I only know one thing. Her eyes met his. I love you. The words finally existed in the world. Spoken. Real. Impossible to take back. For a moment that felt endless, neither moved. Emily's heart raced so hard she could hear it. Then something unexpected happened. Keanu smiled. Not a surprised smile. Not a confused smile. A relieved one. As though he had been waiting to hear those words for a very long time. He took a step closer. Emily. His voice was quiet. Gentle. I've been in love with you for months. The world seemed to stop. Every fear. Every doubt. Every sleepless night spent wondering. Gone. Just like that. Emily laughed through tears she could no longer hold back. The sound echoed softly through the courtyard. You could have said something. So could you. That made both of them laugh. For several moments, neither seemed capable of saying anything else. Words suddenly felt unnecessary. Everything important had already been spoken. Eventually, Keanu glanced toward the building before looking back at her. What about the expansion? The question brought reality rushing back. Emily smiled. For months, she had viewed the decision as impossible. Now the answer felt surprisingly clear. I'm accepting it. Keanu nodded. I thought you might. But, she stepped closer. I'm not leaving Chicago. His eyebrows rose. The board approved a modified structure yesterday. A smile spread across her face. I can lead the expansion from here. Relief flashed across his expression. Not because of convenience. Because neither wanted to lose what they had found. The future suddenly seemed wide open. Bright. Full of possibility. For the first time in years, Emily wasn't choosing between success and happiness. She could have both. And standing beneath the autumn sky, surrounded by the city where her life had fallen apart and come back together again, she realized something profound. The worst chapter of her life had led her here. To purpose. To healing. To love. And for the first time in a very long while, she felt completely at peace. The story wasn't ending. It was finally beginning.